So you'll have probably all heard the news by now that Kell Brook is scheduled to fight mandatory IBF challenger Kevin Bizier. Now, if I'm to see a less appetising world title shot than this, it hasn't been for quite some time. You know, this really is a terrible, terrible world championship fight. This is a fight that is clearly nowhere near pay-per-view level. To be honest, this is a fight I can imagine that Eddie Hearn and Kell Brook will actually even struggle to sell tickets for. You know, I know Kell Brook's got a bit of a following in Sheffield, but he's hardly the biggest name in the sport with the most momentum at present, and it's just such an uninspiring opponent. Now, I know this is mandatory. We'll get to that in a minute. But let me start by saying just how terrible this fight with Kevin Bizier is. For those who don't know, Bizier has 2 losses on his record. Those 2 losses come against the same opponent, Jojo Dan. That's the same Jojo Dan who Kell Brook absolutely dismantled when they fought. You know, realistically, I know Kell Brook's coming back from injury, but realistically, Kevin Bizier cannot really cause Kell Brook any problems. He's got no world-class form on his resume whatsoever, and even when he stepped up to Jojo Dan level, he's lost. You know, this is a substantially worse fight than any of Kell Brook's other world title defences. This is a substantially worse fight than the Frankie Gavin fight. Now, I'm not someone who's been overly critical of Kell Brook in the past. You know, I've been kind of charitable to him, actually. I made a video saying there were some good reasons that Frankie Gavin versus Kell Brook was actually made. And I stand by that. You know, Kell Brook has had his excuses, and to be fair, it isn't all Eddie Hearn's fault. First and foremost, Kell Brook is the IBF champion, and the IBF, as we found out recently with Tyson Fury, are the governing body who are most aggressive in terms of defending their mandatories and, you know, insisting that champions fight their mandatories on time. So the fact that it's the IBF belt does make things slightly more difficult. Kell Brook himself also hasn't been the easiest guy to manage and promote. You know, we know he had the stabbing injury when on holiday, you know, under questionable circumstances, let's put it that way. He's had injuries as well. We know he had the rib injury sustained in sparring, supposedly, before the Diego Chavez fight. You know, Kell Brook has not been the easiest guy to manage. We'll put it that way. But for me, this Kevin Bizier fight is a step even further in the wrong direction. You know, Kell Brook is this top-class fighter who's in the peak of his life. And since he fought Sean Porter, the opposition has actually been getting slowly worse and worse and worse. And we're at a point now where the excuses have got to stop. They really do. Now, I know that this is a mandatory challenger, right? But the problem here is deeper than that. Because if this was Floyd Mayweather, if this was Manny Pacquiao, and I'll go further than that, probably if this was Keith Thurman, if this was Amir Khan, if this was Tim Bradley, they wouldn't be electing to fight their mandatory here, even if they had the IBF belt. And the reason for that is their names and their profiles are at such a level where the belt is not everything. You know, if Tim Bradley was the champion at this stage, he could foreseeably decide not to fight Kevin Bizier, let the IBF strip him if he want, and because Tim Bradley is such a big name, because he's been involved in such high profile events, he could back himself. He could take the hit of losing his belt and back himself that he'd be able to get another very big fight anyway. Kell Brook cannot do that. And the reason Kell Brook cannot do that is because he hasn't made a name for himself internationally. You know, you look at the Americans and you hear them talking about Manny Pacquiao's next opponent, or Tim Bradley's next opponent, or Floyd Mayweather's 50th fight if he comes back. They're not talking about Kell Brook. Kell Brook, to be honest, has been a forgotten man on a global basis. We still know him in the UK, but globally, to be honest, he's a distant figure. You know, he did some real good stuff when he beat Sean Porter. That was real good exposure to him, going over to America, beating a champion in his backyard, doing it well, you know. He could have used that as a massive springboard, but because of circumstances, because of poor fights, he's fallen off the radar a bit. And I think he's actually fallen away from the topic of conversation in the US. You know, I hear much more chat about Errol Spence or Chris Algieri, you know, than I do about Kell Brook right now in the 147-pound division. You know, he's let his profile drop to that extent where retaining the IBF belt is massive. You know, he needs to keep hold of that belt, because at present, that is his chance of getting a big fight. That is his chance of getting an Amir Khan in the ring. That is his chance of getting a Manny Pacquiao in the ring, is holding that belt and hoping that one of them wants to win a world title. So he's in a difficult position, and the position is difficult for a number of reasons. But one of them, I mean, saying that this is a mandatory fight, it has to happen, is not good enough. You know, that's not a strong enough argument for my money, because the real top quality world champions wouldn't take this fight even if it was a mandatory. You know, they'd realise that there's 4 belts in the division, and if someone has a big enough profile, you can vacate the belt and you can focus on the real big fights. You know, if you look at it, I mean, I'm not even sure I know who the 147-pound champions are. I know that Kell Brook's got a version of the world champion, but, you know, the 147-pound championships aren't even really that relevant at this stage. Everyone knows Mayweather, everyone knows Pacquiao. Those are names sort of above and beyond the belts. Yet Kell Brook has had to sit on this belt and has had to take poor fight after poor fight after poor fight to retain this belt because his profile isn't big enough. You know, I think Kell Brook should look at his options. I mean, I heard some discussing about this the other day. I think I was discussing this with my good friend Ultratech Sports on Skype as well, which is that Kell Brook's got to be sitting there looking at Anthony Joshua, who supposedly got paid $3 million for his fight against Dillian Whyte. Dillian Whyte himself, let's not forget, got paid $500,000 supposedly for that fight. And Kell Brook is sitting there getting paid, what, half of that? You know, I'm not sure Kell Brook's ever had a £1 million payday. In fact, if I was a betting man, I would bet that Kell Brook has not had a £1 million payday, and he sits there looking at Anthony Joshua getting a £3 million pay-per-view for a British title fight. You know, that's got to say something about exposure. That's got to say something about profile. You know, you look at the uproar there was that Kell Brook Diego Chavez was pay-per-view. You know, it's because Kell Brook isn't at that level yet. He hasn't had the fights to make himself known to the general sporting public. I think Kell Brook's got to... Yeah, it sounds like he's going to take this fight. And let me say, those purse bids will actually be very, very revealing. Because mark my words, this fight isn't pay-per-view. And I doubt even Eddie Hearn will have the temerity to try and put this on a pay-per-view platform. And I think this is one of those. You know, Eddie Hearn's been very critical of Frank Warren ticket sales recently. He's been very, very critical of, you know, the attendance at Saunders Lee. This is a difficult fight for him because... how many tickets is Kell Brook Bizier going to sell? You know, now Anthony Joshua is this pay-per-view superstar. They're not going to be able to roll out Anthony Joshua in a 10-rounder on the undercard. So they've got to keep Anthony Joshua saved for the pay-per-views. You know, it looks like their deal is done with Eubank. Eubank will be another classic name they'd roll out over 10 rounds on the pay-per-view. So what's it going to be? Is it going to be Kell Brook versus Bizier and one of the McDonald twins and one of, you know, Josh Warrington or Josh Warrington as a sort of 10-round co-main event? You know, for me, this is not a bill that is really going to sell very well. And I think those purse bids will be very, very revealing. Because if that is made public knowledge, we'll be able to work out how much Kell Brook is getting paid. Because the champion gets 75%, the challenger gets 25%. And I suspect that the Hearns will not want this to go to purse bids, as they will not want those figures to come into the public arena. It wouldn't surprise me at all if they get this over in Canada, which I believe is Kevin Bizier's backyard, or the States, and they bill it as a way of building Kell Brook's profile over there, when actually what they're trying to do is hide what could potentially be very embarrassing ticket sales, and hide what could potentially be quite low purse bid numbers being publicised over here in the UK. Now, Eddie Hearn is talking a lot at present about getting Amir Khan, Kell Brook. And that is a massive pay-per-view event. That is an event where Kell Brook foreseeably could earn $3 million, maybe even more than that. He could maybe earn $4 or $5 million for that fight, if he can get a 50-50 split with Amir Khan, if they can sell out Wembley Stadium, and if that does the pay-per-view numbers that I suspect and that probably the fight will generate. But if that fight can't be delivered, and let's be honest, there's a high likelihood that fight won't be delivered, because Amir Khan does not seem to have that fight as his first choice right now. You know, he's been calling out Mayweather, he's been calling out Pacquiao. I've even heard him calling out Cotto and Canelo, you know. So if that fight doesn't get made, I don't see how Kell Brook can stay with Eddie Hearn. Because the big fights just are not available for Kell Brook. You know, the top sort of level of opponent that they're going to be able to get is the likes of a Diego Chavez, that sort of borderline top 10 character. And even that doesn't really make Kell Brook into the pay-per-view superstar that he needs to be. You know, is Tim Bradley going to come to the UK to fight Kell Brook? Is Keith Thurman going to come to the UK? Is Adrian Broner going to come to the UK? Is Manny Pacquiao going to come to the UK? They're not. And because Kell Brook doesn't have that drawing power, and because the IBF title doesn't actually mean that much outside of Kell Brook and Eddie Hearn's front room, the question is, what is Kell Brook going to do? Or are we going to be seeing Kell Brook, Sam Eggington, Kell Brook, Bradley Skeet, Kell Brook versus the next 147-pound ranked fighter in the IBF that none of us have even heard of? I understand what I'm getting at is that Kell Brook has to fight IBF mandatories because he needs to retain the belt. I understand he's had injuries, etc. But if he doesn't get the Amir Khan fight this summer, whilst he's still young and whilst his best days are still ahead of him, I think he needs to make a move for his own good. Because if the Amir Khan fight doesn't get made, and that fight could be a game changer, you know, that will raise his profile to the extent that he does become a superstar. But if that fight doesn't get made, I don't see any other fight in the UK for him. And I don't see Eddie Hearn being able to deliver one of those big names I've mentioned coming over to the UK to fight Kell Brook. So I think Kell Brook's going to have to go out to the States, going to have to make his name out there. And he's going to have to fight tough fights. Keith Thurman, Errol Spence, Sean Porter in a rematch, you know, like Tim Bradley. I think he's going to have to go out to the States and fight those sort of names, maybe on PBC, you know, maybe working with one of the other promoters out there. But for me, this Kevin Bizier is the final straw. It's a terrible fight. It's not making any money for Kell. It's not pleasing any fans. It's not selling any pay-per-views. I doubt it's even selling many tickets. And I think that this could be a continual trend in Kell Brook's career should the Amir Khan fight not be made this summer. You know, for Kell Brook, for me, it's the Khan fight or bust, and he can't leave it any longer than this summer. If it gets to April, May, June, that fight hasn't been made, I'll be looking at my options internationally. You know, we know that Uncle Al Heyman is supposedly very, very interested in Kell Brook. Well, even Al Heyman's going to lose interest if he sits through too many more Kevin Bizier fights. So I think it's a real problem. I think Hearn's having a problem managing him. I think Hearn's having a problem getting the opponents in for him. And I think Kell Brook has, at present, failed to become the crossover star to the casual fan and to the general sports fan that a guy like Anthony Joshua has done, or like a guy like David Hay or Carl Frost has done. Let me know your thoughts. How do you see the Kevin Bizier fight? What are your thoughts on Kell Brook's career in general? Many thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this, do give me the thumbs up. As always, comments welcome. Please leave them below. Thanks for watching.